Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. And for people who are unaware of the disputations, every couple of weeks or so, I invite on a new guest, someone who I find their work to be interesting or who I admire. And then we have the format of me asking the guest questions for an hour. And then the screens are turned and the guests can ask me questions for an hour just to make things fair and as well to get rid of any power imbalances and to cover anything that we left out in the first hour. So for this episode of the Disputations, I'm pleased to welcome Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson, who also has the same name as the newscaster. We were having a funny conversation about this before. And Lloyd, I heard about Lloyd a few years ago when he contacted me, and I was very, very excited to hear from him because he is a humanist, and I'm always interested to talk to Indigenous people who are, trying to explore the humanist angle. And then for some reason, I must have been in a highly stressed state or something because it just completely slipped my mind. So I was very, very happy to make contact again with Lloyd. And Lloyd has been involved in a whole bunch of different roles as a psychologist, beginning with the Saskatchewan Indian Federation College. He was the director of life skills. He's also been the director of health and social development with the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. He's been involved with the University of Regina as a psychologist. And then now he is the president of the New Enlightenment Project, a project which I'm very interested in hearing about. So welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Lloyd.
Thank you, Francis. It's good for you. I'm glad that you have me. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yes, excellent. So Lloyd, before we start to get into some of the questions, I was wondering if you could just tell our audience, what your background is, some of the things that you're working on, things that you think that we should know about you. Might be a good place to start.
Well, Francis, you've already hit the highlights of my career. I've been a psychologist for, about 35 years now, and before that I was a social worker. So that should tell people a lot about my personality. I've not been an academic through most of my career. I've been a practitioner. And so the academic world is somewhat new to me, but more recently I've been doing some publishing, and I'm hoping we get to talk a bit about some of my work there. I've published on issues of indigeneity and the structure of the self, and on free will, and I recently published a book. It was published through the University of Ottawa Press on the evolved self. So that's a little bit about my background. Right now, I'm most excited about my role with the New Enlightenment Project, which is listed as a Canadian humanist initiative. And I'm expecting we're going to talk a bit about that because the New Enlightenment Project was started about a year ago in reaction to the phenomenon of woke-ism, which of course you're familiar with. Woke-ism has been taking over humanism.
Yes. No, I've actually seen some things about that. I'm not sure if it was the Atheist Society or the Humanists, but they had all sorts of intersectionality that they were discussing at some meeting. I saw a slide. There had been someone had taken a screenshot of some slide, which didn't seem to me to be reflective of the humanism that I am familiar with. So that's kind of an interesting development that's happening all over the place. But yeah, wokeism is definitely going to be on the agenda. but I was kind of interested to hear a little bit about your kind of work in psychology, your new book on the evolved self. I've looked a bit at your maps that you do of the self, which I was quite interested in. Like you have sort of diagrams that you do of a person's, I guess, a representation of their self. And I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit about that process.
Well, yes. I'm very excited by this process. It's what brought me back to the University of Calgary for my doctorate. Actually, I was I was 50 before I decided to get my doctorate, and what happened was I had been reading some work from Richard Dawkins, who's a strong history in the humanist movement, and he coined the term meme back in 1986 to represent a small replicable unit of culture. Now, I want to stress to any listeners that we're not talking about what is popularly known as internet memes now, although you could call that a subset, because those are definitely units of culture of sort. But we're talking about any work, any unit of culture that has replicable qualities that are larger than just an idea, but smaller than a whole complex of memes, which could be an abstract theory, for example, would be a complex of memes that are put together in a certain order. Now, my idea, which actually I formulated in about 1999, was that we could map the self. If the self, I'm talking more of the autobiographical self, but that is not a complete definition of what is meant by self, but it was popular back then. If there is such a thing as an autobiographical self of how we define ourselves, and that's necessary, of course, using work of, going back as far as William James, it's necessary to have such a conceptualization in order to place ourselves in past events, which we need to do if we're going to reflect on those events and perhaps learn from them. And we need to have a self if we're going to place ourselves in possible futures in terms of choosing a future that is ideal for us. And that's the whole process of counseling psychology, is doing exactly that, is helping clients to take a look at who they are and predicting what will happen, placing themselves in possible futures that they could be empowered to construct for themselves. So I had this idea, and nobody had the nearest person to it was probably Susan Blackmore, a psychologist out of England, who said in a book that she wrote at the time that the self was a complex of these memes. And I said, okay, she didn't define it, I'll define it. And in the process, I defined Dawkins too, because Dawkins was pretty lax. He had an idea, but he left himself open to the charges that he was guilty of circular thinking, because he didn't explain what exactly constituted a meme. He just said that they existed, and that as a result, the idea was put forward that, okay, religions are memeplexes that control people, and he was interpreted to be a determinist as a result, although he rejected that particular label. Anyway, fast forward, I decided I could do something about this, and I said, well, I'll go to university again, because that will give me the structure to do the research that actually became the research that anchored the book that I subsequently wrote a decade after I graduated. So there is the brief background in terms of the self. I have been using it in therapy for the last 10 years. My daughter, who's also a psychologist practicing out of Edmonton, has used it, and we presented on this last weekend at the annual meeting of the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association on using this technique of creating maps of the self in therapy. And I can tell you, you've asked me a question here that I'm enthusiastic about, as you can tell, because when people see maps of themselves and the map is reproduced so that it resonates, they say, yeah, this is who I am. Then it leads to ideas of what can I become? And I've had clients devise their own therapy and start implementing it in between sessions without my input. And that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. But I was just curious because I've seen the pictures of what you've done or the representations, and you have a series of questions. You have a questionnaire. Is that how you? I'm just wondering how you figure out what kinds of things to put on that page with all the different kind of circles that you have. So there's, first of all, identifying the circles. That's the first kind of thing. But the second is that you have some kind of connectivity between the different circles. So how do you determine what circles to put on the page as a representation of the self?
Here is part of my contribution, and maybe my most valuable part, the most valuable part. The definition of a meme, as I use it, is not just a word. Like, for example, the word mother could be a meme. And we might be able to agree on a definition of mother, the word mother, although different definitions are possible. There are ecclesiastical mothers, for example, and this has nothing to do with childbirth. So we can have a difference of definition. But beyond that, and this is where each meme becomes individualized, is the term mother will have different connotations for different people. So it'll have different connotative meaning. Different emotions will be associated with the term mother, and different behaviors will accrue to being a mother. Of course, the behaviors will be differentiated, of course, by our circumstances. Whether we are actual biological mothers or not will have some impact on our behaviors associated with that term. So what I'm saying is that each meme becomes individualized and it needs to be defined. Now, in terms of identifying the memes, there's two ways. There's the pure way, and there's the way we actually do it. The pure social scientific way of defining a meme would be the memes that make up a person's self, is to have a person in session, recorded, describe who they are with probing questions so that they describe themselves as completely as they possibly can. And then somebody has to transcribe that discussion and segment it. And segment it according to, well, there's methods of qualitative research that are devised just to do this sort of thing. So you segment it according to the meaning or theme of the segment. You name it, and then you put all the segments into different bins and see how they are related to other segments, and you can construct your map that way. That is time consuming. Believe me, I've done it. I did that for my doctoral research. There's a quicker way. And we'll call it a quick and dirty method. And it's based on a life skills lesson, because I'm also a life skills coach. Well, you covered that in your introduction in part. And there's a life skills lessons called 10 Persons I Am. What I do and I've gotten results that are similar to the more difficult mapping method that I just described. I ask people to say, well, give me 10 people you are. You know, I'm a chess player, I'm a father, so you list at least 10 things. And then you order those 10 things in order of importance. And what I do is I say, okay, of these things that you are, which could you give up the easiest? And in my case, giving up being a chess player is a whole lot easier than giving up being a father. But eventually the choices become difficult, but they become rank ordered. Then I explore 3 other aspects of the self, 10 things you change about yourself that you could, and we discuss then what that means for your self-definition now. 10 things you like about yourself, and 10 things you believe to be true. And that gives some scope to who the person is. Now, it's not going to be exact, but it's like a road map, a highway map. A highway map does not normally show the hills and the valleys and the vegetation and all kinds of other things. It's not designed for that. It shows you the highway you can get on if I were to travel from here to Calgary, here being Regina. So that's the purpose of a map, of a self map, is to give a kind of roadmap. Now, how you asked about the linkages? How do the linkages work? Well, if memes share a connotative meaning, that is, if one meme leads to another. For example, I worked with one girl who collected heart-shaped boxes, and heart-shaped boxes had a particular meaning for her, and we explored that. But she also, separate from that, identified herself as a person who believes in love, and we explored that to ensure that had the qualities, necessary qualities to be a meme. The 2 things are linked, and the link should be obvious to most listeners. And sometimes the linkages are not quite as obvious as that, but all memes that are connected will share a connotative or affective or behavioral dimension. And when we construct the self in that way, we find that it takes on a certain form with different clusters forming. And so this is how a person can appear to be have oneself in one context, but have a different presentation in a separate context, depending on the triggers, depending on the circumstance, and but it's still the same person because they feel that they're the same person across context and actually across time.
So would this be connected to mental health? So I'm just trying to think of from in terms of linkages to your kind of your profession. When you see a map of these different memes, right? That because each of those kinds of things, I think, is supposed to be a meme of some kind, which is connected to other memes. Can you tell, looking at that, whether someone has good mental health or poor mental health, or is it just done so someone can kind of recognize who they are in terms of their self? Is there indications of a lack of mental illness that you can see from one of those maps?
Oh, definitely. Now, a healthy self will have memes that will indicate volition. Will have memes that will indicate uniqueness. We all need a sense that we're unique in some way. That may not be objectively true, but we need to have that sense within ourselves in order to function.
And how is that volition? How does that, when you're looking at one of those maps, what tells you that there's volition that exists in that map?
Memes that show that I can engage in purposive purposive behavior, that I can affect the future, that I can do things that matter to me. So, for example, I once worked with a woman of Chinese ancestry, and this is a good example because she's from what is considered a collectivist culture, and there are people who think that the self is a Western idea, and that's not totally true. But the selves could present in different ways. What I found, and I've worked with people from both collectivist and individualist cultures, and they have the same pattern unless there's a recognizable mental health issue. And in her case, one of the things she talked about was wanting to take her parents, who were still in China, for a visit to Toronto. Okay, she had an idea. She had a plan to meet that idea and to talk to her parents about that idea. She had a volitional self. Now, I was able to map the self, and in her case, she had a volitional self that included the notions of individualism, and she also had a very strong collectivist self, which included ideas of deference to community and deference to authority, and that showed up in herself. And in terms of who she was quite traditional, and she ended up experimenting with the volitional self, having seen it, and she decided it was too much work. She preferred to emphasize a collectivist, the collectivist aspect, where she ended up, and this is her words, she described herself as a robot. She was more comfortable being a robot, following the order, following the advice of the wise people, than being an individual. That didn't mean that her individual self did not exist. It meant that she had a preference in her case. And that preference could have been culturally instilled, although I can cite research that would challenge that, because in one study in Hong Kong, mind you, Hong Kong is a special case, isn't it? 80% of school children in Hong Kong and showed better mental health if they had a concept of free will, and this is presumably in a collectivist society. So I'm not given to simplistic answers here, but what I am saying is that the self is, in my perspective, is something that has been culturally evolved and became culturally a good idea. It has great survival value, and the structure of the self that we use in order to regulate our behavior became cross-cultural. For example, Buddhism is what? About 1,500 years, no, it's more like about 2,500 years old. Buddhism has a concept of no self, and we can get into that, but what they mean by that, and it's been highly.
This is the blank.
But they don't really. But they don't really mean it, I'll tell you that. And I've worked with many Buddhists. They don't really mean no self in this way that a person who says there's a self, as I say that there's a self, would mean it. They have selves. They just don't treat their selves or who they are in what they would call an egoistic kind of way. So anyway, but the Buddhists have this concept of no self, and they were a proselytizing religion, and they expanded from their core base in northern India, and wherever they went, they came across people, cultures where people had selves, and so they had to preach their concept of no self to these people who had selves. And so that's how widespread, cross-culturally, the idea of a self is. Now, the other question you asked, and I'm getting back to that, is can we recognize mental health problems from looking at a self map. And I'm going to give you a typical psychologist answer, yes and no. Certainly, things like Asperger's syndrome people have that they cannot relate to intimacy, which is a part of a healthy self, is being able to have intimacy and to family. For example, one Asperger's client I had typically said, "I'm a son," when I was constructing a self map. But when I went to define what that meant, well, he was grateful that his father gave him a place to live. That was the extent of it. So he was not capable of the level of emotion that many people would put into the meme son. So yes, you can recognize, and so his all the structures dealing with the whole area of intimacy, well, what was retarded. Now, it was more than that too, because one of the things that he was very interested in was environmentalism. Now, when you examined what that meant for him, he was interested in reading about environmentalism. He could quote you all kinds of statistics, but he didn't have the feeling for saving the environment that we expect environmentalist activists to have. So yes, from a map you can recognize different syndromes. Now, I'm going to qualify that too, and that is, I think this is a criticism of my field that I think is to some extent justified. It's we tend to put labels on things, and the idea of self-mapping is to take a look at the whole individual, and irrespective of what labels the American Psychological Association DSM manual, whatever the latest version is, puts on people, and instead you look at the whole self and say, this is your functioning, this is how you define yourself. Is it complete? Are there ways we can define it further? Are there ways that you can use what you have here to gain a greater sense of well-being?
And you're mentioning that. I heard you talking about that in another episode, whereby someone who has suicidal thoughts or some kind of depression, or by them looking at their map, they can figure out a little bit, or at least it helps them to kind of figure out a way to improve their mental health by perhaps expanding some areas, developing linkages with other aspects, shrinking. If they're obsessive about something, for example, then they might be able to shrink that part of their map and expand other parts of their map. Is that correct? They can, by seeing that representation, they can figure out how to change things a bit.
Exactly. I have had one client who was a youth with suicide ideation. And she actually was referred to me by a clinician who had seen her for 20 months and had used cognitive behavioral therapy, which has proven efficacy. And she'd also been placed on antidepressant medication. Both therapies worked in the short term, but then she relapsed, and he referred her to me, and I used what I knew at the time. I used cognitive behavioral therapy. I used Adlerian psychotherapy with respect to childhood issues, family of origin issues, and possible trauma, and same results. So when I went to map this person, I told her with an air of confidence, well, let's make a map of yourself and find out what blockages are blocking treatment here, because these treatments have been shown to be effective in other situations. And if we can identify the blockage, then we might be able to do something about it. So yeah, we went through this procedure, and what we discovered at the map is depressed person was the core of how she identified herself.
Mm.
Now, and then suicide ideation was attached to depressed person, but it was a depressed person that was the core, which meant that she had the largest number of those lines called edges between it and other aspects of her self-definition. Not only that, we were able to identify her ruminative patterns in herself, because the patterns, each meme acted as a heading and an outline, and she'd go from one meme to the next, and in a circle, and she would ruminate, and so that was a great way of finding what interventions need to be made, but also how herself needed to be reconstructed.
So wokeism.
Oh,
Does wokeism affect how the self is mapped? Have you noticed anything to do with wokeism and the self? Or first of all, maybe I should get your definition of what you think wokeism is.
well, thank you. Thank you for asking me that, because really the questions about my meme mapping are not central to the New Enlightenment project, but wokeism is.
Yes.
Because although there could be a relationship, because when I observe the woke in action, and I think you've experienced this yourself. I've certainly experienced it because I've been a victim of woke bombings, but not to the same extent you have.
Yeah.
It's not unusual to see woke bombings. It happens all the time. I see a lot of anger. The woke will say they're acting out of compassion, but their behavior shows a lot of anger and hatred. And this has psychological implications. But in terms of what wokeism is, I see it as an evolving phenomena that has been it's been evolving for quite some time. I don't think there's been any theorist who sat down and said, I'm going to create woke theory. And I don't think any of the names that, like some of the names that have been used are things like critical race theory. Well, it's not particularly critical because they reject critical thinking. And it's not a theory either. It's not a theory at all. A theory is something that's testable. No, it's a statement of belief. It's a dogma.
Yeah.
So it's not critical race theory. It's not identity politics, although identity politics is certainly part of it, but it's not the whole thing. It's not neo-Marxism because although the lineage can be traced to Marxism through the Frankfurt School and so on. Although there is a lineage, Marx would not recognize it, not at all. And in fact, part of it through postmodernism can be traced to Heidegger. Heidegger, of course, did a marvelous job of deconstructing science and reason, drawing partly on his Catholic upbringing, I might add, that science and reasoning were inadequate. He did a good job of doing that in Being in Time. But in fact, that deconstruction was copied by the early postmodernists in the 1950s. But what they did not copy, but what reappeared is Heidegger's idea of Dasein. Now, Heidegger recognized that pure relativism was impossible, and he was saying that we need a higher authority. And this sounds awful religious, doesn't it? A higher authority to define what ultimate reality is. Now, he said in his writing as rector of one of the universities, Frankfurt, I think it was, and he said that he and the Führer were Dasein. Well, okay, that's kind of typical. But what he really was saying, I think, was that in any case of pure postmodern relativism, which he didn't use that vocabulary, that design would have to reappear for a movement or a society to exist. And that's exactly what woke has done.
And that was, sorry, I just don't quite understand this. You said the sign?
Yeah, design, D-A-S-E-I-N.
And what is that? I don't even know what that is.
Okay, that was Heidegger's. Heidegger created his own language, which the woke themselves tend to do, but Heidegger was doing it in the interests of his theory, fascism. Design in German means literally being there.
Okay.
But in Heidegger's redefinition of the term, he meant a special quality of being in the past, present, and future simultaneously so that you could determine ultimate realities. He believed he could do that. He believed that the ordinary people, working people, middle-class people, if we wish to use that term middle class, these people were, he called them sheep. They were not people who, they were people who need to be led.
And but in terms of the effect on the self, do you see that this has an impact on how the self is mapped? Like people have said, for example, with respect to wokeism, that there's quite a lot of narcissism that's happening, or narcissism seems to be some kind of thing which is emerging with respect to how people are viewing themselves. And I'm wondering whether, do you think that that's happening? If it is happening, is it connected to wokeism in some way? What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that wokeism is an anti-intellectual, anti-individualist movement. I'm choosing my words carefully here because they're not collectivist in the sense of society being collectivist, but they're collectivist in the sense of identity groups. That and in this case, they're ascribed identity groups. I think in terms of narcissism, perhaps I would need to do more thinking on that. Certainly, the woke would not agree with that diagnosis.
Well, I thought it was interesting that you said anger. Like I thought it was interesting that you said you notice a lot of anger that exists, even though there's this kind of caring, kind of, this sort of pretense of caring and so on. And I'm just trying to figure out, is there something connected to sort of the idea that you should be accomplishing more than you are, that you're, I guess, resentment that you haven't been given what you're entitled to, these sorts of things, and if that's somehow connected to what's going on here with respect to wokeism and its relationship to the self.
Well, I think entitlements plays a large part of it. Let me just pause for a moment, because sometimes it's not good to answer too quickly. But yeah, I would like, the questions you're leading to suggest a marvelous study. I would love to map the woke self.
Yeah.
I would love to do that, but I don't know if I would get the woke corporation to do that.
I don't know. Like I think that there's certainly a lot of people that I know who are enamored with this, who have some psychological disturbances, and they're in therapy of various kinds. And I'm just kind of intrigued as to whether their kind of conception of the self, whether you could sort of see when you're doing your mapping project, whether the people who have embraced wokeism, whether their self, whether that would be recognizable in some way or not.
Well, the short answer is I haven't done the research in order to answer that question.
Yeah.
I can speculate.
Yeah.
And my speculation would be that the woke self would be recognizable, similar to how the self of, say, a religious cult, a suicide cult, for example, might be recognizable. And that would mean, in terms of the discussion of Heidegger, deference to an ideology. But that doesn't mean that the woke self would be not have a capacity for volition, because the woke clearly do act on their environment to make things happen. So if we define volition that way, they are volitional. Now, would they have a sense of uniqueness? And that's something that is worth studying, because in my experience, a healthy self needs to have that sense of uniqueness. And in wokeism, who you are is a function of your identity group. Not totally, though. And woke theorists will say that, well, people can be simultaneously members of different identity groups, and this could lead to a sense of uniqueness, and certainly a sense of entitlement, which many woke have. A sense of entitlement means I'm entitled because I have unique characteristics that make me deserving of that entitlement that I demand. I'm not sure. This is worth a study, but I'm not sure I could get a CIHR grant to do the study.
So just going on with the wokeism kind of theme here. So you're involved in the New Enlightenment project. You're sort of concerned about wokeism. How have you seen wokeism affect humanism? What's going on with that in terms of the effects that wokeism has had on humanism?
Well, here's the battle between woke humanists, if I can call them that, and Enlightenment humanists. Enlightenment humanists are traditional humanists. Enlightenment humanists value science and reason and believe in things like due process and fair play and respect for everyone. These are humanist values. Now, the woke will say, well, we believe in wokeism, we believe in human rights, and these are the rights, and we're against racism. That makes us humanists. And this is how we define racism. So I think they truly believe that they are humanists, but they don't acknowledge diversity of opinion or freedom of speech. I'll give you an example. I was a moderator with a humanist discussion group a couple of years ago. And this is when people were tearing down statues of John A. Macdonald. And somebody suggested that well, Macdonald should not be punished for things that he did not do during his lifetime and could not be anticipated. For example, during Macdonald's lifetime, there was no compulsory education at Indian residential schools was not there. In fact, the Indian Act was not changed to make Indian education compulsory until 1920. Although it could be argued, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think, did, that effectively Indian agents had the power to send children to school in when was that? 1896. Although they had the power, for the most part, they did not do that. In fact, one of the criticisms of that Bryce made in his report in 1907, or 1906 rather, was that Indian agents were not sending kids to school, that only half of children with treaty numbers were going to school. And he said that was scandalous, and he argued there should be more residential schools built, but that's another controversy. Anyway, the point was, this was after poor Sir John was dead. And if you look at John A. Macdonald's life, he was empathetic. He gave Indigenous people the vote in Ontario. It was later rescinded by a subsequent Liberal government. In negotiating the treaties, he instructed his negotiators to be generous with their terms, because he didn't want north of the kind of bloodshed and warfare that was happening south of the 49th parallel. He didn't want that north of the 49th parallel. So here John A. Macdonald is being characterized in a different way. And so someone made the argument, okay, what you're saying about residential schools is true, but they happened after his death. The woke piled on that. He was characterized as someone who believed in raping children and raping and torturing children. Now, you disagree with tearing out a statue, and suddenly you are characterized as being guilty of raping and torturing children, or favoring the raping and torturing of children. That's not compassion.
And is this, like, what is it about wokeism that leads to that kind of leap, that this kind of sort of almost demonization of anyone who tries to, you know, have some kind of empathetic kind of response to historical circumstances or what have you? How is this happening with respect to this whole kind of woke kind of framework?
Well, wokeism is a lot like a religion, isn't it? And as has been said, a religion, I'm thinking of a secular religion now, it can get away without having a god. You can have a religion without, but you have to have a devil. Wokeism has a devil. Anybody who disagrees with woke ideology is obviously evil.
Yes,
that's where the hatred is coming from. It's the old good versus evil dichotomy that we thought we had gotten rid of when we tamed religion.
I'm very interested in looking at how this all kind of emerged, this kind of way of looking at things. But I don't want to not ask you, because we don't have that much time left, unfortunately, in your segment. I've just been watching a bunch of materials that you have produced on indigenizing the Enlightenment. And I don't want to miss out on this, because I wanted to hear what your thoughts were on indigenizing, what that is, whether you think that there's a future, and like if this has got some answers for us in the future. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what that is.
Well, the Enlightenment, of course, freed the mind from the control and strictures of controlled thought patterns, and it led to a scientific revolution that we're still experiencing today. It allowed for the creation of new knowledge, but it's built on a set of skills, and that is a technology. It's not a cultural thing. It's a technology that anybody can learn. When I was director of life skills with the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, we tacked on an extra year for students in our program to learn basic thinking skills and patterns of behavior that would help them to succeed in the university. And we were successful. There's a whole new generation of Indigenous scholars that were able to get degrees and practice their skills, and it was a marvelous experience to be part of. But then along came the idea that this was racist. Why should Indigenous people have to spend an extra year at university to get a degree? Okay, the why is I think is obvious, and it's not racism. The why is, if you didn't get the skills in your home reserve communities, you need to pick them up somewhere to be successful. So that is, I think, part of a beginning of what I think we're talking about earlier, and that is that there's a view, and this is a highly woke view, that there are different ways of knowing, and that science and reason, that's a white male way of knowing. In fact, that was told to me by one of my professors at the University of Calgary. Actually wrote that in an article. Science is a white male way of knowing. Okay, that's a very woke view, isn't it? And the corollary of that then is that Indigenous ways of knowing are equally valid and need to be preserved. And so teaching the Enlightenment skills that have brought such a tremendous growth in knowledge, that's assimilationist, and assimilation is a negative thing. We need to protect, we need to resist that kind of assimilation. And so the progress that we made in the 1980s in Indigenous education, it's gone backwards. If you look at the growth in university degrees in the 21st century, white kids were already ahead. The gap has gotten greater. The education is not there, and part of the reason is the devaluing of the Enlightenment. I think
to this ways of knowing, like when you're mentioning the Indigenous ways of knowing, do you have any sense of what's being referred to there? Like, is there something specific that they're getting at when they talk about Indigenous ways of knowing?
Well, one of the things, it's rote learning. It's culturally accepted ways of doing things. I think it's anti-Indigenous myself, from my experience. I don't think that Indigenous cultures, at least I'm not aware of any Indigenous cultures, that traditionally believe that they had a way of viewing the world that could not be challenged. I think the Indigenous cultures, when talking to the elders and looking at the traditions, it was of a pragmatic nature. What's happened now, though, is there's a search for Indigenous ways of knowing as a kind of religion. And then it becomes codified, and you have to believe in this way. Otherwise, well, it's not that you're evil. It's that it's that if you don't accept these ways of knowing, then that is the dogma. Then you're unhealthy in some ways.
Well, I've often seen spiritual beliefs, it seems to me, often are part of what's considered to be Indigenous ways of knowing. And I believe it's Marlene Brent Castellano. She did an important piece that was kind of delineating these things. And one of the things she mentioned was revelation. So revelation was one of there was kind of learning through sort of observation, various forms of observation, but that would be sort of like a proto-scientific kind of way of knowing. But then there was also this, what was called these revelatory ways of knowing. So you would go on a vision quest, or you would have a dream where you would communicate with the ancestors and so on. And according to her, that was one of the ways of knowing, which is part of this indigenous ways of knowing that's being referred to.
Exactly, and those are cultural practices, and they can be instructive and valuable. I had one person tell me that he decided when he was 19 years old that he had to define what being an Indian was, because he defined himself as a big Indian. His family was not particularly cultural, so he went on a vision quest. He learned cultural ways, and this had input in him defining who he was and how he moved forward in life. He also was a Taoist, and so he had those two traditions that he leaned on. But in the end, he was quite pragmatic, because he was taking these teachings and he was individualizing them, applying them to his circumstances in his life, and he was interpreting them. And that meant that he was actually a child of the Enlightenment too.
So when you refer to indigenizing the Enlightenment, what exactly are you talking about there?
I'm talking about taking some of the practices, and in an article I wrote, I use the medicine wheel as an example, and I show that the medicine wheel is not, there is not the medicine wheel. Nowadays, people talk about the medicine wheel, and by that they mean a structure that actually has 4 colors and is divided into physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And they say that is not traditional. Traditional, the circle represented holism. And how you defined holism depended on the context and depended on the individual as well. And so in my article, I point out that the stone wheels on the plains, there were about 343 of them, were all kinds of different characteristics. They weren't necessarily divided into 4. Some were divided into 26, 2 of them anyway, and they weren't divided necessarily with spokes coming from a central cairn either. They could be divided by straight lines across the circle. Some had petroforms added to them, and that does not mean necessarily that it looked like a wheel, but if you have a Thunderbird attached to a wheel, but the ceremonial significance is obvious. So yes, the medicine wheel concept can be used in a variety of ways, and it can be used in enlightenment ways too, to demonstrate a variety of concepts. And in my article, I demonstrate how I use the medicine wheel to define my profession. And I point out that all the therapies that I use an X and a Y axis. Now, was the X and the Y axis traditional to 14th century indigenous people? Probably not. That's a form of mathematics that was not, but it's a way of showing relationships, and I do that to place physical, behavioral, emotive, and cognitive therapies in relationship to each other. And I suggest that changes on one aspect of the wheel will automatically affect changes in the other aspects. Now, that particular inspiration isn't necessarily mine. In fact, I can tell you it isn't mine, because Cree elders have been saying that since I was a little kid, and their elders were saying something similar too. Not that they were using the X and Y axis, no, but they were saying that everything is interrelated. So we can use things like that
Yeah.
to connect to the past and to tradition, that also can connect to the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment skills that we would like all people to be able to use. My view is that the woke view, that there's different ways of knowing, and that Enlightenment is a Western thing. I think that's racism. Because I would like Indigenous people, and I would like people of all cultures to be able to have the same skills, to be able to knowledge. And it's a difference in worldview. Because in one view, and I think this is the woke view, knowledge is static. In a progressive worldview, knowledge is accumulative. We're always learning new, and nothing we say is the entire truth. It's all open to challenge. It's all open to new information, and that's a frame that we need to teach.
So this medicine wheel, because I've been interested in the medicine wheel as well, in terms of its because it has the kind of the four aspect, which is, when I've seen it used, it basically is just a way, this kind of not the one that you see in Wyoming or anything like that, but the kind of the standard one is just a way of dividing things into four, it seems to me.
And
Like,
not only that, Francis, but what is called the medicine wheel is obviously not traditional. How do I know that?
Yeah.
Because the word mental did not appear in Indigenous languages. So therefore, whoever created this version of the medicine wheel, which became the medicine wheel, was thinking in a European language, probably English, when they devised it.
Yes. And I actually was at some kind of indigenizing symposium, and there was an elder that was giving a talk on the medicine wheel, and the audience was quite horrified when she identified the four races in the black, the yellow, the white, and the red, and said that the black people had rhythm. So there's all these people who are just trying to get this to absorb this into our thought process or whatever, and then heard this kind of quite stereotypical view of the different races and so on, which in any other context everyone would have been, they would have found that kind of be sort of an embarrassing kind of situation. But there is kind of this pushing, according to this, which I don't think, as well, I agree with you, as I don't know where that came from, but it was, where was this four different colored thing? Was there a person who developed that? Have you traced that at all as to where that came,
you weren't raised in a fundamentalist Christian family, were you? It comes from an old children's Christian song that says, Jesus loves the little children. And then there's a phrase that goes, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in it. So isn't there a huge irony there? That now that children's song, Christian children's song, is being used. The concept is being used as a traditional Indigenous teaching.
Yeah.
Now, when you think about it, the absurdity of it should be prevalent. Before contact, there would be no way that people indigenous to the Americas would have known how many other races there are, or if there were four or a dozen, or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, there's various ways of structuring race.
It was very amusing, the whole thing, because of the condescension that was going on there. So people couldn't really oppose it when an elder, like, this is sort of the whole critical thinking thing, is that elders have some true things that they say, they have some false things that they say too. As if everyone has true things and false things that they say. But there's this kind of encouragement that, whatever, it's kind of almost got a sacred kind of character to it, that you should just kind of accept everything that's stated. At least that's the kind of pressure that we get in the university system. So there was a bit of a dilemma of the audience that, they were hearing, if anyone else had said something like that, that would have been kind of consternation. That would have met where, characterizing the different races with these, these kinds of attributes, which, is highly stereotypical to associate that with various, quote unquote racial groupings, which is even to some extent contested in the literature, that there is, these kinds of very, very specific kinds of racial categories anyway.
Well, yeah, and it's been argued at quite some length that the idea of the red man doesn't exist because and we've had a football team in the United States change their name because of that. And in fact, it's true. There's no race that's red, but then when you think about it, there's no race that's yellow either. And I challenge anybody to show me someone who's not an albino. Well, albino doesn't count because they're pink. Nobody is really white. Hold up, and by the same token, blacks are really, the blackest people are really dark. We're all shades of brown.
Yeah, it's just melanin. It's just melanin.
Exactly.
So skin color. Anyway, Lloyd, well, we have reached the 1 hour point, so perhaps that's a good time to turn the screens and allow you to ask me questions, which you think are, either on the themes of Indigenous policy or wokeism or anything else that you might think would be interesting to talk about.
Okay, well, I'm going to enjoy that. I'm going to enjoy this, Francis, because this is a fascinating area, and I really enjoy your perspective on it. The whole idea of indigenizing a culture and the idea that culture is see, there's two views of culture, isn't there? Mm-hmm. One view of culture is that it is static, that either you have it or you don't, and it's something that can be learned. And that view of culture, I think, is quite prevalent. But there's another view of culture, and it's the one that I personally hold, that culture is just an averaging, just of the personal characteristics of people who identify with a particular culture. So if I can use myself as an example, in my family, I was the first person in my family on both my parents' sides to ever go to university. Mm. So going to university, it becomes a bit habit forming because I ended up with 5 degrees. So it was sort of a safe place, but it affected me. It has to affect me in some ways. Mm. And so there are people who will say, Lloyd, you're white. Yeah, and because in fact, I've had elders tell me that if you have even a little bit of Aboriginal ancestry, you have a choice you can make. You can choose to be Aboriginal or Indigenous, or you can choose to be white, but you can't be both. You have to make a choice. Well, that's a very fixed view of culture. But in my case, my family did not reject me, but my ideas and my thinking changed, and it's affected my families, and so it's affected my family culture.
Mm.
And if you get enough people changing, growing in knowledge, getting an education, that is going to that is going to change the community culture. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going on a long tangent
So
here.
in terms of
Before you
culture,
ask the
but this is
question.
about like in terms of what culture is, which it was quite interesting when I was hearing you talk about this in another context. You mentioned that technology is not part of culture. So culture is kind of almost the image that people have of themselves, or the various kinds of forms of consciousness, I guess, is how you were phrasing it when I heard you talking about another context. And I was thinking about that. That's kind of interesting, because the definition of culture that I've kind of kept with me is Leslie. He's an anthropologist. His name is Leslie White. He's one of the most famous cultural evolutionary anthropologists. He said culture is the ability to symbol. That was his definition of it. So, for example, an ape, a chimpanzee or whatever can sort of understand water in the sense that they have to drink it or whatever, but they can't understand, they can never understand the difference between water and holy water. So to be able to understand something like holy water is a human trait, because we can sort of have this abstraction where there's a difference that, like, there's no chemical difference at all between water and holy water, but we understand that holy water is something that a priest or whatever has blessed, and whatever goes on there. I don't I'm not an expert in this, but the ability to have that abstraction is, for him, was seen as part of kind of what is considered to be culture. In terms of the technology, I was kind of interested in that, because I've often seen technological things as having some kind of cultural characteristic to them. But it's true, they can kind of be, they create different kinds of conceptions within a group. So, for example, a society which has an automobile is going to have different kinds of ways of thinking about things and different images of itself and so on than a society which still has just horse and buggy and so on, or something like that. So the automobile is an integral part of what we would consider to be the culture, but it's not actually the culture. It's a piece of technology which enables various kinds of understandings and conceptions of the self and all these sorts of things that happen within a group, I guess.
Well, yes, the automobile is not the culture. It's the interpretation of the automobile, the significance that is placed on it. That is the cultural aspect. Same as with the water. Interpretation of certain water as holy water, that's interpretation. It's like homeopathy. If I can draw that, it's an interpretive stance. It's not an actual physical characteristic. Incidentally, and I'd like you to get your reaction to this. But I was not the first to observe this either. But the automobile, actually not the automobile, the half-ton truck is a very significant, important part of Indigenous culture. How do I know that? Because every reserve I go to in Canada is filled with half-ton trucks, and people know how to fix them, mechanics. Even in the Athabasca Basin, I don't know if you know the Athabasca Basin, but there aren't any roads up there. I went to a meeting of the Athabasca chiefs in one of the reserves up there. Flew in, got a ride from the landing strip to, and the meeting was at the school, and the school was surrounded by half-ton trucks. They had to get their trucks via barge from Alberta across Lake Athabasca because there's no roads to get there from. Yet it was important to them that they have their half-ton trucks. Okay, here's my question on that. You've been attacked for challenging certain cultural presuppositions. How do you integrate the story I just told you about the half-ton truck with the idea that you are badly mistaken, perhaps even racist, for challenging the notion that another technology needed verification in terms of mass graves?
Yeah, well, that's the ways of knowing. So in terms of the and you've written on this subject as well. You have a very interesting piece on the residential schools and so on. But this was part of the problem in terms of my own circumstance with questioning the claims that are being made, and my particular research is about the Kamloops case. So what's happened there is that the way of knowing, so that particular way of knowing of the knowledge keepers, has claimed that 215 children are buried in the apple orchard. To question that, to say, no, well, that needs more evidence. There needs to be more evidence than just to say, I believe that, or I think that's the case, or my ancestors have told me that, or what have you. That's seen, to challenge that is seen to be highly inappropriate. Like that's kind of the problem. And we really still haven't gotten back. We haven't gotten past that at all in this situation. We're still dealing with it right now, where, I really think that we need to have excavations in that area to get to the bottom of what's going on there. And if there's anything to that, or if it's just kind of lurid tales that have been told over the last 20 or 30 years, starting with what it is that this defrocked United Church minister, Kevin Annett, was saying in the 1990s. But that's kind of the problem with the Indigenous ways of knowing these kinds of claims, is that it's being tied to Indigenous identity, and to challenge that is really almost, some people would claim, is to almost deny the humanity of Indigenous people. That's kind of how far it's going with that, when it's just a claim that's being made about reality. Like, are there 215 children buried there or not? That's kind of the question. And I don't think in any other context, in any non-Indigenous context, perhaps maybe with woke-ism, there might be other groups now that are thrown in there, but there's not really the same kind of demand to accept that as being infallible or to be without question, as is the case with the sort of Indigenous policy right now.
Well, here's the contradiction, isn't it? Some things like half-ton trucks and ground penetrating radar are acceptable technologies.
Yeah.
But digging up the graves, digging up the ground to see if there are graves and how many, and how old the people in the graves are, and what are the circumstances around their deaths? Was it pneumonia or was it something else? These kinds of things. Well, we can't do that because the elders have said, and to do that would be implying that we don't believe the elders.
Yeah.
How is it? I guess you're not really the person that I should be asking this to. We should be asking this to someone else. How is it that some technology is simply technology and can be appropriated, and it's not cultural because it's just technology, but other things cannot be done?
Yeah.
Have you any insights on that?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is it's got a political dimension to it. So with respect to well, first of all, with the wokest kind of logic, Indigenous people, according to this whole way of thinking about things, they can appropriate anything, and that's fine. Like that, because they're the oppressed. Like they're part of in terms of this spectrum scale of oppression. They're the most oppressed, so they're entitled to do whatever it takes to overcome their oppression. So cultural appropriation by Indigenous people of non-Indigenous cultures is completely fine. It's just the dominant groups and their use of technology. That's the problem. So that's the kind of wokeism, the logic of wokeism is that things are not there's not a universal standard that's applied to all things. How your application of it is going to depend upon whether it's perceived to help the group that's perceived to be oppressed overcome their oppression. So ground penetrating radar is fine because that's a way of assisting the Indigenous groups or members of the Indigenous groups to overcome their oppression. But excavating and so on, that might not be good, because that could then have a negative impact on whatever political goal there is with respect to this. So it's really, things are judged in terms of their ability to bring about empowerment and overcoming of oppression. But that's a difficult thing, because what some members of the community regard as being important for overcoming oppression might be completely at odds with what other members of the community believe is important for overcoming oppression. And we see that with the hereditary chiefs kind of arguments that go on all the time, like with the pipelines, is that certain members of the community think that the pipelines are a great idea. This is a way to bring jobs into the community or do this and that. So for them, this is important. But then for other segments of the community, it's seen as being a destruction of the land and all these sorts of things. So if you're trying to judge this from the outside to say, what should I get behind and what should I support? It's not very clear as to what side one should support. For some strange reason, all the woke got behind the hereditary chiefs.
Like well, I don't think that's strange.
Okay, why is that? Why would they be drawn to that immediately and not to because they democratically elected or part of the colonizer and that sort of thing? Is that how that's seen?
Because the hereditary chiefs, and I know there's a discussion as to how they ended up doing that, but the hereditary chiefs came out for a position that reduced the economic efficacy of the system. You see, the woke are against this civilization, and so they're against any aspect of the civilization that will allow the civilization to continue. They want to destroy it. So of course they're going to. Now here's a question for you flowing from that. Okay, the woke will tell minority people that minority people are entitled to all kinds of entitlements, and hey, that's good to hear. You want to give me free money, I'll take it. Or if the reason I didn't become a famous hockey player has nothing to do with my abilities at hockey. It has to do with racism. Well, okay, that's an excuse. I mean, I can buy that. I don't have to take responsibility for my failures then. Okay, are the woke, because we've talked earlier about the majority of woke being white. Are the woke as a political movement selling something to minorities for political gain? Is that their game?
Well, certainly it's about making it difficult to oppose what it is that's being argued. So that's really there's an interesting guy. I'm not, you might be familiar with him. His name is Alan Sokol. I'm not sure if you've heard of Alan Sokol, but he did a famous hoax in the, I guess it was the 1990s, where he got a sort of a postmodern piece published in a, he was pretending that some kind of postmodern theorist was consistent with some idea in physics and so on. But anyway, I was very taken with many of the things that he was arguing, and one of the things that he talks about is postmodernism. It's really kind of a wrecking ball. That's its character. It's trying to take away your ability to raise an objection based on reason. That's its nature. So postmodernism is very inconsistent because it argues these dogmatic positions all over the place. And you think, well, how can this relativistic type of perspective, make these dogmatic types of assertions? Well, the relativism is just its kind of tactic to make it difficult to oppose it. And once it's kind of, it's sort of got people confused, then it moves in with its real project, which is this kind of totalitarian imposition. So that's kind of the nature of what goes on all the time with these kinds of arguments. And actually, there's a military analogy that is used to describe it. You might have heard of it. It's called the Mott and Bailey maneuver. And I hope I've got this right, because I've just heard other people describe it, but there's the castle, which is the dank and unpleasant kind of thing to live in, which you just use as a defensive posture. And I believe that's called the Mott. You just do that to defend. And then there's the Bailey, which is the really fertile, nice valley that you really want to acquire. So what you'll do is you'll have this kind of definition of something which is untrue. It's kind of got a interesting sound, but it's untrue. And you go for that. That's kind of the Bailey. And then when someone challenges you on it, then you use the true meaning, which is kind of banal and self-evident. And that's kind of the dank castle, which is your fortress, your defensive. So this is constantly happening in these kinds of word games, which is very disorienting, because you think you're arguing about one thing, which is this kind of irrational, obviously untrue thing, which sounds interesting. And then when you challenge it, then you get it turned into this kind of true definition, which is actually just kind of banal that everyone accepts. So this is kind of the nature of postmodernism, is that it really is trying to make this kind of totalitarian assertion, and all the relativism and everything is just the kind of destabilizing kind of mechanism that it uses in all these kinds of maneuvers that are going on. So I think that's kind of what they're trying to assert control over whatever it is. And in the university system, it's basically resources, like trying to grab resources for various kinds of programs. And they're using this relativistic kind of this kind of position to destabilize everything. So then when everyone is in this kind of discombobulated kind of state, then they grab and they assert control over the system. So I think it's a power ploy that uses these confusing language games to prevent people from opposing what it is that they're doing. And that's what I've kind of noticed over the last kind of 20 years of dealing with all this, because it's frustrating because there's not really a lot of consistency in what's argued, but that's because the consistency is kind of the rational position, and they're kind of anti-rational. So
the consistency is an understanding that it's a tactic.
Yeah.
So that when we are playing nice and we're using logic and reason, it's like we're playing chess with the opposition. But if the opposition the woke in this case are not playing chess, they're really playing battleship, and they're looking for, they're exploding bombs in a way in order to destroy your ships, and you're busy trying to play battleship, playing chess. You're going to lose.
Yeah.
They're going to overturn the board. Is what happens. So they retreat. If I can interpret what you're saying, they're after control. They're out for control. They want the Bailey, and if they're forced into retreat, they retreat it back to their battlements, and they say, "Oh, I'm just against racism." That's not bad, is it? I don't want racism to be in the world. That then is their Mott that they retreat to. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, and you notice this with the systemic racism and racism kind of, those are the two things which are used interchangeably. The systemic racism is the Mott, so that's the defensive thing. Like that's kind of something everyone can agree to, because it's like, well, obviously there's some kind of systems in place, and I can think of, in terms of Indigenous people, for example, all sorts of restrictions on ownership and so on, which probably had economic consequences and so on. So that's systemic racism, and everyone's in agreement with that, right? That's the Mott, so that's the defensive position. But once they get people to agree to the systemic racism, then it becomes actual racism, like attitudinal racism. And that was what was kind of happening to me, is that I wasn't being accused of being a participant in systemic racism or anything like that. I was accused of actually being a person who had racist ideas, who was, wanting to oppress Indigenous people and so on. But when you would say, well, what is your evidence for, and this is always going on in all these battles, what is the evidence that you have for racism? Like these, since 2020, May 2020, George Floyd thing, all these accusations, they say, oh, no, we're talking about systemic racism. So they're saying there's racism, there's terrible racism that's all across the university. It's like, okay, and that's the Bailey, to get everyone to, there's rampant racism everywhere, and we need to have mandatory anti-racism training to get people to admit their racism, so on. You keep on hammering away on, okay, well, we need specific incidents of racism of what you're talking about. Then, oh no, we're talking about systemic racism. So that's the Mott, that's the defensive position. So those things go back and forth all the time. And depending upon whether they're kind of gaining ground or they're retreating to get a defensive position, that's what you see all the time with these two different types of things, which have very different implications. Dealing with racism, which is this, like, certain people saying that a group is inferior and should be deprived of rights on that basis. That's a totally different strategy in trying to deal with that than to deal with, sort of economic circumstances which might have deprived groups in the past and have resulted in them not being represented to the extent that they are in the system, and so on. So that's a very, very common thing. These kinds of accusations of racism, which are made, which are never substantiated. That's just sort of the amazing thing, is with Evergreen, which is the most noticeable and the most extreme, Evergreen State College, for people who aren't part of the previous conversation. There's a great documentary, Benjamin Boyce, on YouTube, 24 episodes, where wokeism just completely took hold of this college. All these students are screaming and yelling about this horrible racism, which is the most progressive, university in the whole of the United States. Is like, how can that be the case? And these people feel that their lives are threatened on a daily basis, and all these kind of incredibly outlandish kinds of claims. It's like, okay, well, what are these instances that you're talking about? Give us one example. There's never any substantiation of it, right? And that's kind of this Bailey kind of maneuver. And then if you really are able to force people in the end, then you get some kind of, the fact that, there's the Black population in the United States is 14%, and there's only 5% Black professors that are at the university. Like, that's the systemic racism kind of argument, but which gets trotted out after you've just kind of smeared the whole population as being just completely racist, to the point that Black people feel that they can't even be on campus because they might be killed because of all the violence and everything. It's like, anyway, that's the kind of thing that goes on all the time in these contexts.
I think if you understand that they're playing Battleship, a lot becomes clear, doesn't it?
Yeah, like, it's not principled at all. And that's kind of the frustrating thing, is that you can sort of feel yourself losing your temper, like, in these kinds of contexts. And that's a huge mistake, because then you look like you're some kind of really angry person who, is just losing it, kind of thing. But it's a difficult thing to know how to address. Like, that's why I kind of reverted to satire at a certain point.
Yeah.
Is because I felt I was not able to get any traction in terms of the rational arguments. And so I thought, I had heard that satire was one way into this, to kind of expose things if reason was not prevailing as a kind of a method.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, in your experience, because you've been on the receiving end of a very serious woke mobbing.
Mm-hmm.
Many people who have been victimized have decided, taking a look at the arraignment of forces, and I don't believe the woke would have acted on you as they did if they did not think that they had the administration of your university in their pocket. That they're very strategic that way. It's not a rational argument. It's an argument for power, and they're going for power. But faced with those kinds of odds, many people have said, okay, it's like a Soviet era trial, isn't it? I'll admit my guilt and I'll throw myself on mercy. I will beg for forgiveness. Did that ever cross your mind?
No. I knew I was very well. That's one benefit that I've had, is I'm after 25 years of kind of being an observer of this, and sort of 25 years ago, that's when it all started with the traditional knowledge stuff. And then going through it, I had a very good understanding of the opposition, much more so than people who are kind of caught unaware, like people who have spent their life being used to people, acting fairly and so on. And then they just they're a deer in the headlights, and they'll sort of just panic and do things to apologize when you don't. Now, if you've done something wrong, that's another thing entirely. People, if you do something wrong, you shouldn't be afraid to admit mistakes and so on. But if you feel that you've done nothing wrong, I'm just amazed at people who apologize. Like this is just throwing red meat to the lions. Like, it just is a terrible thing to do. You have to stand your ground, and I have stood my ground completely. Now I still got taken out, even though I was standing my ground. But because I stood my ground, I have a much better defense than I would if you give in when you shouldn't give in. Then now you've got to explain yourself as to why you deleted your tweets, or you apologized, or you did, like this sort of thing. I have not given 1 inch in this case, and I'm going to fight it out. And I have these great recordings of my Star Chamber episodes where I was facing off against, the authority figures, where they were trying to get me to show remorse. It's quite funny, because they were trying to, do this. And I was going, what do I have to show remorse for? What do I have to accept responsibility for? I am just behaving according to the rules that have been put out there. And it's the university is the one that is the one that's failed in this regard. Should the university show remorse? Like, is this like, if you're demanding people show remorse, why aren't you showing remorse in this instance? Like this kind of, this kind of standoff that's happening, which although temporarily it didn't work, in the long run, when it all becomes public and everyone's able to hear everything that's gone on, I haven't made a mistake in that regard. And that's where I think Wendy Mesley, really, and I understand why people do it, is because they think that it will make the people who are going after them sort of take pity on them or something like that, right? And Wendy Mesley did this horrible groveling apology, which was just, absolutely cringe. Like, it was just cringing. I was just cringing when I was reading it, and I know why she did it, but that was a really serious mistake that she did, because now she really doesn't have any. She got taken down anyway. That's what people don't understand, is that they think it's going to make people lenient towards them, but it actually hardens the opposition against you. So, that's one thing that I would really encourage everyone to do, is that if you think you're right, fight it out. Like, don't give in, fight it out. And you might lose in the end anyway, but at least you've created the principled position that people who want to take up the fight after you will be able to use. So, and that's going to be very interesting to see how things work out in the arbitration process, because I haven't, in every single scenario, I've not given up any ground, and Mount Royal has had to take me out as I've stood up against them. And I think it's gonna, in the end, I'm gonna be exonerated, but we're just gonna have to let it play out. But if I'd apologized or shown remorse or accepted responsibility, then, how can I really disagree with all the punishments which have been levied against me, because I've admitted that I've done these whatever wrongdoing, but there's been no wrongdoing that's happened. And in fact, there's lots of other people who've done some, highly dubious things. But I said to Mount Royal, look, I'm happy to back away from all of my complaints against people and just say, okay, policy wasn't clear. Everyone got wrapped, sort of embroiled within the moment. Let's just kind of, clear the slate, develop some policies which have some kind of rational basis for them that we can apply evenly across the population, and let's just start over. Let's just hit the reset button. But they wouldn't listen to any of that. So but yeah,
Well,
so don't,
yeah.
unless you've done something wrong, don't apologize. That is really not a good idea.
Canadians are known as a polite people, and Canadians are known to apologize just for offending another person. But we have to recognize that the woke don't play nice.
No.
They operate by a different set of rules, and I want to touch on that in a roundabout way. Do you think Donald Trump? We had to raise Donald Trump, didn't we? Do you think Donald Trump lost the 2020 U.S. presidential election due to widespread voter fraud?
I don't think so. This is a difficult question because I don't, and this is something I've talked to other people about, and actually Brett Weinstein, who you might know, he's the guy who got kicked out of Evergreen. He's got his own podcast, and I was listening to him, a podcast with him, I think it was yesterday. Anyway, he was talking about, the institutions are failing. Like, there's massive institutional failure. And this is very, very difficult for people because we operate on the basis of trust in our institutions all the time. And we can't, it's impossible for us to go around being skeptical of everything all the time. And, it's impossible for me to, it's something that's impossible for me to evaluate, other than to say the United States has a system of you know, counting ballots and scrutineers and all sorts of things that have been in place that are highly developed, I find it difficult to believe that the institutions have crumbled so much that they can't, you know, have a system of properly counting ballots in the United States anymore. But, you know, there's people who are saying that, you know, Frances Widdowson wouldn't have been fired unless she had done something terribly wrong, because there's no way that a university like Mount Royal would have acted unless that had been the case. So, and that's, you know, the case against me has been completely fabricated by Mount Royal. So, you know, I don't know, like we're kind of entering into this sort of very frightening time where you can't trust the institutions anymore. Like they're just
well, yes. Now, in your case at Mount Royal, there is a process, and you'll have a chance to introduce evidence, and then there'll be a deliberation. It sounds like you're fairly confident you're going to win. I certainly hope that's accurate.
yeah.
In the case of the 2020 elections, Trump, if you recall, on election day, Trump was ahead and he declared himself to have won.
Mm.
And he lost on the strength of the mail-in ballots. So he and his supporters interpolated from that okay, it was the fraud of the mail-in ballots that caused the loss to occur. Now you can recognize the circular thinking of that, because okay, now they've done their best to cover that particular base. Have you seen the documentary 2000 Mules?
No, I haven't.
Okay, have you heard about it?
Vaguely, but I couldn't tell you. Not to any great extent that it's left an impression on my mind.
It's a marvelous bit of, well, I'll say propaganda, but it shows people who are going to polling stations and dropping off ballots, but the faces are hazed out and the identities are not given, and so how much stake we can put to it, well, people who are already committed are going to say, hey, there's our evidence that that there were lots of people making voting that shouldn't have. The documentary claims that there were 875,000 votes that were manufactured to swing the election. In fact, well, you'd have to believe that the U.S. Judiciary is in on this, because these claims are made by 4 judges and thrown out. So, okay, what we have here, and this is where I'm getting back to the discussion of the woke, what we have here is an interpretation that, okay, there was a result that was unacceptable. The Trump supporters deemed it to be unacceptable. Therefore, there had to be voter fraud.
Yeah.
I'm saying this sounds like postmodernism to me, because the woke would say, okay, there's a result that we think is unacceptable in terms of, you said that there was only 5% of profs in the United States are Black. Therefore, it has to be systemic racism. Do you see a parallel here? Is Trump really a postmodernist then?
Well, that's kind of and I was with Sinclair McCrae in the last disputations. He was kind of made a very good distinction between the process of developing knowledge. So you have your scientific method and so on, and then you have the results of that. And that the results of that is open, because it's going to depend upon the whole process that determines what the effect is. So you can't predetermine it. You have to go with whatever the evidence and the methods are that enable that to happen. What happens with the woke is that they have a result that they want, and then they structure the processes to align with that. And that's, that could be the same thing with Trump and the election. And people were saying pretty much before I think the election even happened that they weren't going to accept the results, right? Like that's a bit of a sign that there's not there's not really principled kind of thinking that's going on here. And it's basically the people in the United States now don't really accept the democratic process anymore. They're heading towards a civil war kind of scenario, because people were saying even before the election took place that they weren't going to accept the result if it was going against what they had wanted. But it's becoming very difficult now because things like, well, just what I've seen with the unmarked graves is a good example, is that there have been no bodies found in the Kamloops case. There's been ground penetrating radar that has had soil disturbances, which we know that soil disturbances and ground penetrating radar, that doesn't necessarily mean remains. It could be other things. And so we don't really know. But I see constantly in the media references to the unmarked graves that have been found, remains that have been found, and these media outlets. I'm in a research group that has been sending out information to journalists for the last year, every time a story is done, trying to correct. So it's not as if it's unknown, and they're continuing to do it. So you see that sort of thing happen in the media, and you go, like, that's going on in that case. Now, maybe that's just a completely isolated sort of incident, which is not having any bearing on anything else, but I doubt that's the case. I think there's a whole bunch of other things that are happening where journalists want a particular result, and then they go out and they get, corroboration for what it is that they want to see happen. I'm not a Trump supporter. I think Trump is, like, it's kind of a frightening kind of scenario in terms of his, being in the reins of power. But I do notice kind of biased coverage against it. Like I think that there's just kind of a set anti-Trump position, which, most of the time I'm in agreement with. But just because I don't like Trump and I'm not a Trump supporter, that doesn't mean that I think that he should be treated unfairly. I think investigative journalism should work the same way for all parties involved and not have a skew to it that's going on. And I although I don't know, I'm suspicious of the ability of the media and other institutions to act in a fair kind of way in a context where they're opposed to things. So things are going in a way now, which I have a hard time, and all I can sort of do is kind of listen to. I try not to have an echo chamber go on in what it is that I'm listening to, and I try not to jump to conclusions without at least kind of considering oppositional kinds of viewpoints. But it's becoming a really difficult kind of environment to be able to come to conclusions about, because no one can be an expert on everything. Like you have to have a certain amount of trust of other people. And I was very taken with Brett Weinstein, because like he was making a good case that he tries to be on, like he's not captured. He tries to be honest. If he's wrong, he admits that he's wrong. And I kind of ended up, after hearing him, I sort of felt a certain amount of trust. But he's kind of been saying things about the vaccines and everything, and then got completely attacked by Sam Harris. And so I'm always been historically a fan of Sam Harris as a very rational person. So it's like, I've got Sam Harris attacking Brett Weinstein and basically calling Brett Weinstein a fake and of this and of that. And I was like, and so when you sort of see that happening, you're going like, shouldn't Sam Harris show a little bit more humility, I guess, that perhaps Brett Weinstein, in looking at the lab leak theory and the problems with the vaccines, and like like maybe there's something to that. At least we should kind of take a step back and try and allow things. But especially with the COVID stuff, I find it's very tribal, and it's hard to it's hard to kind of remain sort of slightly uncommitted about things and listen to different perspectives about it. But I think Trump is a bit like that, is that, you know, you sort of feel compelled that you just got to be anti-Trump on everything and just get that guy out of there. And, which is not necessarily what the truth of the matter is, which, I think there should be more, maybe, and so I'm becoming slightly, uncertain about things now with respect to that. But I find it hard to believe that the election system in the US has been that corrupted, is my general sense, but I definitely could be wrong on that score. I can definitely see certain forces within the United States mobilizing against Trump and saying, we got to get this guy out of here. It doesn't, like, we'll just, the ends justify the means in terms of this, perhaps.
Well, if what you're doing, Francis, it seems to me, is you are being reasonable. You're using reason. You're looking for evidence. You're acknowledging that you might not have all the evidence and that you could be wrong in certain cases. And you're surprised when someone like Sam Harris appears to be so attacking and so certain on something. You are playing by the rules. You're playing chess. You're playing Enlightenment chess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, the
and it's
other
just
side,
like, it's a bit disappointing, like, because
yeah.
I have great respect for Sam Harris. I have great respect for Brett Weinstein.
Well,
And I know that those two guys, historically have had good relations. And then I thought it was a bit strange to hear Sam Harris talking about Brett Weinstein in the way that he was, which, like, Brett Weinstein can be wrong, like definitely, but I don't think he's a dishonest person. So I would be inclined to just, say, okay, we've got these different kind of perspectives on it. Let's look at the, let's look at the different positions and let's look at the evidence, be a little bit more open about it rather than, this guy's obviously lost his mind about something or whatever. But I was kind of surprised about.
Well, here's my point behind that statement. It's that I viewed wokeism as a kind of virus, as you know. So what I mean by that is it has mutated in certain directions, and I don't believe the originators, if we can say the originator, I don't think they have control of it. I think it's and I think it's infected the entire society. And one of the ways it's infected people who are not woke is it's reduced our level of tolerance. And I've seen that. You brought up the vaccination, the coronavirus issue, and I've seen that clearly where people were demonized simply for having a different opinion, and people were not waiting to see what the opinion actually was. They assumed that you were either for vaccines, or you were an anti-vaccine person who denies science, not understanding that there might be middle grounds there, and there might be counter evidence. And so they were being very totalitarian in their attitude on that particular issue. There wasn't a whole lot of forgiveness. Where I'm going is the possibility that our entire society has been infected to a greater or lesser degree. I'd like you to respond to that possibility.
I think so. And I think, sort of it's an identity politics a little bit, that's what is my biggest fear in the future, is that we're going to have woke identity politics, and then we're going to have the corollary of that, which is going to be the white identity politics. That's going to be the nature of the whole dynamic here. And I think what's happening is because of the assault that's been happening on the Enlightenment since the 60s. So postmodernism, that's what postmodern, it's a wrecking ball. it's trying to basically challenge reason as the way in which we can try and figure things out. And because of that, that's been disintegrating. It's been happening, and it just kind of took off with a vengeance. And like a couple of years ago, we really are reverting now to these kind of tribal enclaves, which is kind of how, and that's kind of the default position. So Sinclair McRae, when I was talking to him last Disputations, he was talking about, and it was an interesting, I hadn't thought about it like this before, system 1 and system 2 types of thinking. I guess system 1 is instinct, or things which are just, you act on your emotions, that sort of thing. And system 2 is reason and, checking your, your basic instincts and so on. When we're getting rid of the system 2, which is kind of the Enlightenment kind of values of reason and so on, fairness and all these kinds of ideals, then we revert to the system 1 aspect, which is basically tribalism reasserts itself. And really that's when you have to sort things out through force. Like that force is the way in which it's going to be sorted out. And that's just, that's kind of the totalitarian kind of dynamics, which are gonna, if we don't kind of get things back onto the system 2 thinking, reasoning, going through deliberation, trying to not be subjected to groupthink and confirmation bias and all these sorts of things, it's going to really be coercion, which is going to be how things are settled in the future, which, it's kind of frightening when, we've sort of grown up, at least my whole experience has been, you go through these processes, they're fair, or at least they might have some quirks and so on, but they're generally fair. And if you lose the thing, well, it just didn't work out for you, and you're just organized better the next time, kind of thing. Like that's sort of the democratic kind of ideal. And I realize some people, that's not I've been a person who's not been discriminated against, really, like I guess women long time ago, but certainly not within, I've never really had any discrimination that I've had to experience, whereas other people have. So that must be very frustrating for them to have had discrimination. And then, that kind of makes them distrust the system. But I think we've been gradually over time working towards a less discriminatory type of system. And it seemed like in the future that we were moving towards that. And although it wasn't perfect, it was getting better. Now it's like going backwards. It's like we're in this kind of reactionary period. And it's quite disconcerting to be trying to get things to be progressing, and you just feel that the forces are going in the other direction.
Well, Steven Pinker, in his books, Enlightenment Now and most recently Rationality, has pointed out how our society has gotten better over time on a whole host of measures, in fighting poverty and fighting illiteracy and fighting racism. Yet he has been vilified, hasn't he? There's been the humanist leaders, the humanist icons like Pinker and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. The woke have taken them all down, or tried to.
Yeah, well, I think, they're white, white male, cis white males, like they don't really, within the woke kind of way of thinking about things, they should really spend some time on the bottom of the hierarchy and, shut up and listen and so on. Like, I think.
But it's white males leading the charge, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's kind of this, as we've said, wokeism doesn't have to be consistent. It's just a wrecking ball that, prevents any kind of, structure from being asserted to.
Yeah, but but it's not the person of Steven Pinker. It's his ideas
Yeah.
that they find offensive. The idea that we can have progress, like the progress you've mentioned,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure. I'm not sure where we're going with this.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a society. I interviewed Pinker recently,
Yeah.
and he's hoping, he has hopes that we will recover, but he recognizes the attack on academia, and you are part of what another recipient of that attack,
Yeah.
but one of many. And earlier this month, the University of British Columbia Task Force on Anti-Racism and Inclusive Excellence Task Force declared the University of British Columbia to be a racist institution.
Yeah.
It did not use any statistical methods, of course, for measuring racism. It used selective, subjective narratives.
Yeah.
They
And then
replaced,
when you ask for it, right? Like that was the thing at Mount Royal is
yeah,
I after like spending, I guess, and that's when I reverted to the satire because I realized I wasn't really going to make any headway on it. Like asking what is the racism, there was never any substantiation for it. Like it just was very frustrating because it's obviously being used as a tactic. And it's difficult because obviously if there's racism that exists, then you want to combat it and stop it from happening and fight against it. But I think it's race hustling. This is my own view. It's race hustling for a power. It's part of a power ploy to divert resources in one way or another within the university system. That seems to be what's happening. It's possible that there are these cases, but it just, because the demand has been to put forward the evidence for so long, and there's been nothing that's emerged, it just seems it's likely that this is just part of some kind of power struggle.
so is it that racism, as it's defined by the woke, it means that it's anything that the woke do not yet control?
Yeah. No, it's and you disagree, if you disagree with something or you have an opinion about and you're not arguing in favor of any kind of oppressive system or anything, you're just saying you don't agree with the mandatory anti-racism training. So that was me, is that this group, supposed student-led initiative, saying we should all undergo mandatory anti-racism training, and I'm arguing against it, saying I think that's a terrible idea. And it's like, well, you're obviously a racist if you're opposed to mandatory anti-racism training. So it's just all these, I think they're called Kafka traps. I think that's one of the words that's used to describe it, which is you can't win in your denial of racism is evidence that you're a racist. So you either admit you're a racist and you're a racist, or you deny you're a racist and you're obviously a racist because racists deny that they're racist. And it's like, and it just is, it's a very, very frustrating kind of thing. But yeah, it's kind of a bit alarming to watch this kind of, steamroll ahead. But like, as I say, I don't, you're living it, you're in the midst of living it. So you're never sure what's going to cause anything to turn or, but it seems like, we've got a long, hard road. And St. McCrae, as he said last time when I was talking to him, reason is slow. So it's not something that is the default kind of position. So, hopefully there's some kind of mobilizing force to try to rebuild the scaffolding of the Enlightenment.
Well, it's difficult because look at what has been destroyed. We talked a bit about statues, and we talked about institutions, but concepts have been destroyed. And one of the concepts that have been destroyed is the concept of racism. If racism is nothing more than a word that's used as a power ploy, then how can we combat real racism? And will real racism rear its ugly head as a result of these power politics?
Yeah, and that's a scary, that's a little bit, when people are talking about reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, right? Like, I think that's going to be a bit of the danger. Is it's not even like terrible suffering that's going on in Indigenous communities that needs to be addressed and so on. That's kind of what I fear a little bit, is people are going to say, oh, well, they're just always never satisfied, always, so forget about it. Like, we don't want to bother. So it's going to have this kind of really terrible effect in terms of actually, engaged in concerted action to deal with the problems that really do exist. So I think that's kind of, as well, the kind of hardening, you're going to see this kind of hardening begin to occur, which is going to be very sort of draconian and not really being sensitive to things that people should be sensitive to. And we did make a lot of gains in that direction, where, people used to be very, very kind of cruel to people. And we kind of fought against that. And then that was kind of softened. But now we got, all this kind of taking advantage of things that don't even really exist, which then perhaps might make people harden again, when that's not really going to be beneficial to people who are sort of in need of these services the most. Well, Lloyd, I should let you know
one final question, Frances. One more, please.
Okay, one more.
What gives you hope?
You give me hope, Lloyd. So people like yourself, my colleagues and my, people who are battling, who are people who are not, selfish or xenophobic or oppressive people who are, wanting to improve the world, but as well think it should be done using science and reason and logic and the Enlightenment kinds of tools. So, there are a lot of people out there who are not part of this woke group. And sort of the challenges is, one, trying to find who those people are. That's the first thing, is that there's a lot of people who are just keeping their head down and hoping it's all going to go away. So finding those people, but the second most important thing is the organization that's required. So getting people who think it's important to restore Enlightenment values, getting them to kind of act together, because we're all kind of doing our own different things, but trying to develop some kind of organization which will make the sort of movement much more possible than exists right now, when everything is sort of all fragmented into all these different organizations.
Thank you, Frances.
Anyway, Lloyd, well, that was very interesting. We've covered a lot of ground here. And I should mention to people who are watching this is that Lloyd and I did actually have an hour conversation with the Enlightenment Project video, which is also going to be available. So I would recommend, watching them together, because the first hour that we talked kind of, provided the groundwork a little bit for what we're talking about in this 2-hour segment. But anyway, Lloyd, I really wanted to thank you so much. I feel, as I said, I'm kind of angry at myself as to why for some reason in 2017, when you contacted me, I don't know what happened, but it's great that we've made contact, and I really appreciate you joining me today on the Rational Space Disputations.
Thank you.